The Nintendo Entertainment System has no shortage of games based on movies or licensed properties like cartoons and toy lines, but for a console that was mainly targeting a younger audience at the time, you might be surprised at how many titles on the system were based on R-rated movies and franchises. Whether they were attempts to reach older audiences or coming to terms with the fact that kids were probably watching some of these movies anyway is up for debate, but today I just want to give a quick tour through this list of 22 games, along with a few edge cases as well. So get some popcorn popping and let's get on with the show. The Alien movie franchise has seen a substantial amount of games made over the years, even dating all the way back to 1982 with an Atari 2600 Maze game tying into the 1979 original film. But the release of Alien 3 in 1992 was accompanied by quite the swath of video game counterparts, first for the Sega Genesis and Amiga, and eventually with ports and other quite different titles on the Commodore 64, Master System, Game Gear, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, and the NES version you're seeing here. So this came out in the spring of 1993 in North America, so it was kind of a late entry in the NES lifecycle, and it was developed by Probe Software and published by LJN, a name you'll see quite a few more times today. This version is very similar to the Sega Genesis one, where you control Ripley in a side-scrolling run-and-gun set in the same prison colony from the film, with levels focused on exploration and rescuing people and not getting killed by xenomorphs. Each level has a pretty tight time limit, so you'll need to figure out the best route to accomplish this, all with limited weaponry and ammo, and of course lots of aliens to contend with. In fairly stark contrast from the movie, where the quantity of aliens and weaponry were very scarce, there's plenty of fast-paced carnage here, and even survival horror elements add some nice tension to the situation. Just brace yourself for harsh difficulty and lots of trial and error while learning the level layouts. Otherwise, this has some really solid graphics and animations, and a banger soundtrack from Jor and Tell, and a fine example of a quality movie tie-in for the NES. And while we were discussing the Alien franchise, there was also a game planned for the Famicom Disk System based on the second movie, Aliens, but it was eventually cancelled. This game did get a release on the MSX in Japan in 1987, developed and published by Square, and notably featuring a soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu of Final Fantasy fame. And then there's fortunately a playable prototype of this FDS port, which seems mostly complete and can be played all the way to the end. It's a 2D action platformer where you control Ripley on a xenomorph-infested planet with some really floaty and kinda jank movement, and with much reliance on upgrading your gun and jumping potential to keep pushing forward. It's certainly rough around the edges, but considering this was 1987 and it didn't get that last coat of polishing before its release, it's still a fairly impressive attempt at capturing the frantic action and terror of the film. And now for a pretty wacky one with Blues Brothers, based on the comedy from 1980 that is rated R due to coarse language, starring John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd on their mission from God to reunite their R&B group to raise money and stop the foreclosure of the orphanage they were raised in. Now, for whatever reason, 11 years later, Titus would develop and publish a platformer starring the duo, releasing on several computer platforms and eventually ported to the NES and Game Boy in 1992. There was even a sequel for Super Nintendo in '93, which also got ports to the Game Boy and PC. So the NES version here is a fast-paced precision platformer, like ridiculously fast if you're trying to hold down the run button constantly, as you well should. And without much offensive capability, it's really focused on avoiding hazards and landing tricky jumps, with failure often dropping you all the way down to the earlier parts of the stage. Enemies also often pop up suddenly, so there's a lot of memorization needed for any sort of success here. Limited continues to. More like Brutal Brothers. Good luck with this one. Based on the Coppola film from 1992, which was based on the novel from 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula would see a surprising amount of games released across 8 different platforms and consoles, or 9 if you count the pinball table. The 8-bit versions on the Master System, Game Gear, Game Boy, and NES, released in 1993, are all fairly similar to each other, where you control Jonathan Harker in an action platformer where you must escape from Dracula's captivity and rid the world of this evil menace. Now, this wouldn't be the first appearance of Dracula on the NES, of course, with classics like Drax Night Out coming to mind, but this goofy take on Coppola's opulent vision of vampires has a mildly comical shift in tone, with an emphasis on classic Mario-like platforming, even down to the levels riddled with question mark blocks that contain various items. Now, I kinda dig this game. It has a nice challenge to it, especially on hard mode, which is the only way to see all of the levels and the true ending, and your character is smoothly animated and can zip around the screen quite briskly. We've also got an unhinged, abrasive soundtrack here, another Jor and Tell joint actually. Rich with weird dissonance and texture, and it's really unique sounding. This is not quite my favorite Bram Stoker's Dracula game. The Jankster piece Sega CD beat 'em up gets my vote there, but this is still a really fun horror-themed game on the NES. (1993) would also see the release of a handful of different games based on the action movie Cliffhanger of the same year, starring Sylvester Stallone, with games on the Amiga, Game Boy, Game Gear, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Sega CD, and the NES version here, developed by Spidersoft. And for such a late title on the NES, oh man, this is a pretty ugly one, basically using the same teeny tiny sprites and assets as the Game Boy version. It controls about as well as it looks too, where you awkwardly have to hold up to run, and it's nearly impossible to do simple things like grabbing ropes, and the platforming and combat in general is definitely a struggle. On the positive side, it does make efforts to follow the movie plot through some basic cutscenes, and you can burn money to get warm and refill your health, and most importantly, you can ride this guy's body down a spiky mountain slope. As trashy as this appears, it's honestly one that might grow on you, and it can be a fun and easy little garbage game to beat in an afternoon. Sam Raimi's movie Darkman would hit theaters in 1990, a pulpy superhero horror action hybrid that was created after Raimi was turned down by Universal to make an adaptation of The Shadow. And this was his first big budget Hollywood project, and it did decently enough to spawn some forgettable sequels and a handful of video games published by Ocean Software. The NES version was developed by Painting by Numbers, and puts you in control of Darkman in an action platformer with some rather slippery feeling controls and steep momentum curves in your movement and physics. You'll be running and jumping through very precarious stages, while you can also kick, punch, tightrope walk, and climb up walls. This one is notoriously difficult, but it does feature some solid, colorful graphics and great music, and some other cool mini-game-like moments as well, like the shooting gallery-ish section where you need to take enough photos of someone in order to recreate a mask of their face that you can use in the following stage. A really fun tie-in to an actual plot element from the movie. If the weird controls and vicious level design isn't a turn-off, you should give this one a try sometime. And one of the best Christmas movies of the 80s would also see a few video game adaptations. That's right, Die Hard on the NES, which wouldn't release until a few years after the first movie came out, and also followed different game releases on DOS, Commodore 64, and even the PC Engine. But finally on the NES, we'd be able to control John McClane and take on Hans Gruber and his squad of terrorists who have taken over Nakatomi Plaza. It's kind of a top-down shooter, but but with some adventure game and survival elements, as you must navigate between various floors of the building with limited resources, all while that clock is ticking. This has some pretty ambitious ideas, like being able to overhear enemy conversations with your radio, sneaking into air ducts, and some differing outcomes of the story depending on your actions, and multiple endings. And let's not forget that foot meter, a separate health bar for your bare feet that depletes when walking on broken glass. But with ambitious ideas often comes questionable design choices and player confusion, so this can be a tricky game to get a handle on. It does have some notoriety in the speedrunning realm, however, with top times in any percent categories clocking in at a mere 2 minutes.
Go ahead. Make my day.
And unless you count a 1995 pinball table, here we have the only game based on Dirty Harry, a gritty film series with its beginnings in 1971, and starring Clint Eastwood as a tough anti-hero cop asking punks if they feel lucky. This surely was an attempt at reaching an older demographic, right? So it's a little surprising there was only an NES game and not a slew of home computer versions. But whether or not this was a valiant attempt at making a coherent game is up for debate. Dirty Harry was published by Mindscape and developed by Grey Matter, a Canadian dev studio who up to this point had titles like Infiltrator, Technocop, and Mad Max on the NES under their belt, a game we'll get into later in our list today. Here you play as Harry Callahan, running around San Francisco basically just blasting anyone in his way of finding a drug lord hiding out on Alcatraz Island. Words fail me a bit on how much of a hot mess this game is, but it definitely veers into the so bad it's good category for me, and I really want to spend some more time figuring this one out and eventually conquer this janky experience. And based on the hugely successful slasher movie franchise that began in the early 80s, Friday the 13th is an ambitious attempt to bring the iconic Jason Voorhees onto the NES, published by LJN and developed by Atlas. You control a team of 6 counselors trying to survive a weekend at Camp Crystal Lake, searching for any weapons or clues that might help you fend off Jason's relentless rampage and protect the other campers from his frequent attacks. While this one has often been negatively received, likely due to its cryptic nature and unforgiving difficulty, this is a proto-survival horror classic in my book, and was undeniably terrifying to the little kid version of me, full of jump scares, constant time pressure, and one of the most brutal game over screens in history. Now, this certainly has its flaws and frustrating elements, but it's a must-play for horror film fans if you can push through its unique quirks. So I will admit that out of today's list, Hudson Hawk is the only movie I haven't seen before, a Bruce Willis action comedy that not many other people watched either when it first released in theaters, retrospectively regarded as a box office flop, and even earning a Razzie Award for Worst Picture that year. Yet, it still received a smattering of video games across the usual suspects of computer platforms thanks to Ocean Software, along with Game Boy and NES ports published by Sony. You control a teeny little sunburned Hudson Hawk, a pro cat burglar who has been blackmailed into stealing valuable Da Vinci artifacts. It's a mix of precise puzzle platforming and stealth gameplay, and you have to avoid lots of lasers, guards, dogs, and various other random animals. At least you have some tennis balls to throw to defend yourself. Now, I haven't gotten far in this one at all, because it's really tough, but I think it might actually be pretty fun if you don't mind a bit of trial and error while making your way through its tricky level layouts. The Lethal Weapon series of buddy cop flicks starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover had a handful of tie-in games come out around the same time as the release of Lethal Weapon 3 in 1992, with Eurocom developing the NES and Game Boy versions, published by Ocean. The NES game lets you play as Riggs or Murtaugh in a kind of a belt action beat-em-up, taking on various generic thugs and criminals and helicopters across Los Angeles. Notably, you can also use guns and grenades, but oddly enough, they seem pretty terrible and ineffective compared to hand-to-hand combat most of the time. Now, there are certainly worse movie license games on the NES compared to this, but this does get a bit repetitive and boring fairly quickly, but maybe check it out if you dig the movie series. Speaking of worse, let's look at another Mel Gibson action flick adapted to the NES with Mad Max, released in 1990. This is also another Mindscape published and Grey Matter developed title like Dirty Harry, which we looked at earlier, and it's again bringing a rather old and quite violent film series with an exclusive title for the console. Despite the game title being simply Mad Max, the setting here is more loosely based on Mad Max 2, aka Road Warrior, which was released in 1981. And the game's concepts recycle a lot of ideas from another older Chris Gray computer game called Road Raider. The gameplay is focused on surviving a post-apocalyptic wasteland with limited fuel, ammo, and other supplies. Basically, you're driving around looking for abandoned mines where you can then enter on foot, gathering up supplies, and then trading those supplies to some dude in a shed for more fuel and anything else you need to keep going. And eventually, hopefully, you can afford an arena pass to take part in a destruction derby style fight and then move on to the next level. It's brutal, bad, and possibly misunderstood. I don't know, this is one that might require some real effort to figure out and have fun with. Otherwise, a typical playthrough just ends up driving around for a minute or two until you run out of gas. Here we have another LJN published take on an essential horror franchise, this time facing off with Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street. An original prototype of this game actually had you in control of Freddy, but likely to avoid the ire of Nintendo and some angry parents, a more conventional side-scrolling beat-em-up platformer was developed by Rare, seeing you control a generic teenager collecting Freddy's bones in efforts to burn them to dust in the local high school furnace. It does have a pretty cool sleep meter mechanic, where if you can't manage to stay caffeinated, you may find yourself drifting off into a more challenging dream world. But this is also a world where you can imagine yourself as an amazing athlete, ninja, or wizard. You can even bring along some friends for the journey, as the game supports up to 4 players at once, provided you have the adapter to do so. Interestingly enough, this is the only NES platformer at the time with a 4-player mode, and it's chaotic as hell in practice, but pretty fun if you can wrangle a group together. Either way, this is a really solid fun platformer with a wonderful soundtrack by David Wise, and I consider it one of LJN's best games on the system. And in what might be the most unlikely candidate for an NES game in today's list is Platoon, based on Oliver Stone's brutal and intense war film from 1986, based on his own experiences as an infantryman in Vietnam. Developed by Ocean Software, Platoon would get similar games for a wide assortment of computer platforms and was eventually ported to the NES in 1988 by Sunsoft. It has 4 action-focused stages, each with their own gameplay style and perspective, starting out with a side-scrolling jungle maze filled with enemy soldiers and traps, and then a dungeon crawler FPS kind of thing going on for stage 2, a shooting gallery stage for the 3rd, and a top-down shooter for the final stage. Other than the static 3rd level, it's quite easy to get lost and overwhelmed by enemies since you have limited ammo and soldiers. Even morale is a factor to consider. It's a pretty ambitious multi-genre experience for 1988, but again, just kind of an odd choice to adapt such a serious and heart-wrenching war movie into a video game. Well, finally, Arnold Schwarzenegger makes an appearance in our video today with the 1987 sci-fi action horror hybrid blockbuster Predator, the beginning of a big franchise with its fair share of ups and downs and tons of video game adaptations still coming out to this day. The first film saw game adaptations on 9 different computer platforms and an NES port, with this version developed by Pack-In Video and being quite similar to the MSX version. You play as Dutch in some glorious pink pants, unarmed at first, but gradually collecting different weapons as you traverse through levels, fighting lots of random wildlife and other non-Predator enemies. But if you can survive some questionably designed platforming stages, you might be able to reach Big Mode, where the sprites are big and you can finally battle the titular Predator. At the time, this game's computer ports were pretty well received, but the NES version not so much. Controls don't feel great, and it's pretty difficult at first, especially when it's easy to think you might be soft-locked at the very beginning of the game. But I'd say this can still be a pretty fun time if you don't get frustrated by the jank. And we've got another Pack-In Video developed movie tie-in up next with Rambo, loosely based on the 1985 movie sequel Rambo First Blood Part 2, where Vietnam vet John Rambo is released from prison in exchange for going on a reconnaissance mission to find the presence of POWs, and shifting the tone towards bombastic action over the gritty, more personal story of the first Rambo movie. That tonal shift was also accompanied by a big merchandising push, including action figures and even a kids' cartoon, so it's no surprise that it also got a fair share of games made over the years. The NES Rambo is unique among the many other Rambo games that hit home computers or even the competing 8-bit home console, the Master System, with this game taking an action RPG approach, and with the aesthetics and some mechanics immediately echoing Zelda 2. It's certainly not as expansive, however, but it does have a basic leveling system, and sections of the game split up into small open areas that you must navigate while your mission somewhat closely follows the story beats of the film. Now there's definitely some silliness happening here. Again, like Predator, you end up fighting a lot of random wildlife, or there's even flying skulls showing up at one point, which I can only assume to represent John's PTSD or something. And the dialogue cutscenes and their character portraits are pretty hilarious. Rambo's sprite alone is worth loading up this game for. But aside from that, this is a surprisingly fun and somewhat ambitious action-adventure here, with a nice balance of combat, exploration, and some very memorable boss fights. Robocop is another great example of an ultra-violent movie with heavy merchandising efforts, including toys, cartoons, comics, and video games. The masterful satire, social commentary, and comically over-the-top violence from Paul Verhoeven's 1987 original film obviously would be hamstrung for these kid-friendly products, but the overall concept of a half-cyborg, half-human cop also fits snugly into a typical action gameplay concept. The first Robocop would see a ton of games released in the years following the movie's success, including arcades, many computer platforms, and the NES version, developed and published by Data East. You could call this one a run and gun, but maybe a walk and punch is more accurate for a large chunk of the game. Robocop ambles along quite slowly and can only fire his gun during certain moments of the level. He's also unable to jump, and even climbing stairs is truly a struggle. So his mobility is a little frustrating if you're comparing this to Contra or something, but at least it's very faithful to how he moves in the movie. Now I'm a Data East apologist, so I have a real soft spot for this one, and I enjoy it a lot despite its clunkiness and the dastardly choice to have the select button being used to block attacks. Robocop would get a pretty decent film sequel in 1990 despite the lack of Paul Verhoeven, and naturally another array of games on many platforms. Data East would again publish an NES adaptation of Robocop 2, but with development duties this time handled by Painting by Numbers, who also developed Darkman, which we looked at earlier. Robocop 2 uses essentially the same game engine and slippery control scheme, although Robocop definitely feels even heavier and needs more momentum to jump across large gaps. Yeah, he can really jump around in this one, a stark difference from the first game, and the level design heavily emphasizes difficult platforming. You also have these special quotas for the stages, where you must collect a certain amount of nuke drugs scattered about, along with rescuing civilians or arresting dudes. Failing takes you to a fun shooting gallery training screen, but frustratingly you may have to keep repeating stages until you meet those quotas. You at least have unlimited continues, which is nice since this game is really hard. A lot of people trash on this one, but if you like some difficult jank, I think this one is a blast. I should also mention there is a Robocop 3 for NES as well, but that movie was actually PG-13, so we'll stay out of trouble and ignore it for today. Seven years after its original film release in 1984, The Terminator would finally start to see game adaptations, likely due to the immense success of T2 releasing around that time, and both films would see an explosion of games in the following years, and plenty more Terminator games still being made today, despite the franchise's box office struggles with its more recent film efforts. The first Terminator game would be for DOS in 1991, but the NES got one in 92, published by Mindscape and developed by Radical Entertainment. I'm sad to report this game is not very rad, unless you care to control an unwieldy Kyle Reese, dodging sewage droplets and awkwardly shooting random Terminators running around. I'll admit I've never gotten very far in this one, so maybe it gets better, but if I had to pick the jankiest game on our list, I think this might win that coveted prize. Fun fact, Sunsoft was working on a Terminator game in 1989, but lost the license mid-development. But they would later rework it and release it as Journey to Silius, a really solid run and gun with an absolute banger of a soundtrack, so at least check out that one. Terminator 2 Judgment Day would be a huge hit in 1991, and again had a massive push of video games released across almost every computer and game console you could think of. LJN would snag the license for an NES game, with development handled by the British company Software Creations, who up to that point had made 12 other NES games, including Solstice, Wolverine, and Silver Surfer. Now, this one is definitely a step up in production quality from that other Terminator game, with better graphics and an incredible soundtrack by Jeff Fallen. It also makes valiant efforts to follow the story of the movie, but the actual gameplay is still kind of questionable. It's ambitious, difficult, and maybe worth digging into deeper if you have the patience and a love for the franchise. And before we wrap up the Terminator stuff, there was a Robocop vs. Terminator game for the NES that was based on the comic. Unfortunately, it was ultimately canceled, but there is a playable prototype if you're curious. And our final Arnold game of the day is another bombastically violent Verhoeven cinema classic with Total Recall. And I might sound like a broken record by now, but this got a ton of computer ports and an NES game. While Ocean Software was handling the various computer versions, the NES take would be published by Acclaim and developed by Interplay, with considerable differences, and it actually makes a fairly valiant effort to stick to the complex story. Even down to leaving in the brutal moment where Quaid guns down his fake wife, and including details from that scene like her aerobics outfit and the security cameras showing Richter and his henchmen approaching their apartment. There are of course other very weird liberties taken. I don't remember the part where he beats up all these hobos, or getting attacked by rats in back alleys, or whatever's going on with this fence. But full disclosure, I actually really enjoy this game in all its janky glory. Everything looks and sounds kinda goofy, the controls aren't great, but I really dig the variety in gameplay across the various stages and how the movie's plot is loosely presented. I'm also a huge fan of the movie anyway, and that might play a huge part in that, but I'd still recommend giving this a fair shot sometime. And our last game in today's tour of R-rated movie games, we have The Untouchables, based on the 1987 Brian De Palma blockbuster crime flick about Elliot Ness taking down Al Capone in the 1930s. Yet again, Ocean Software would pump out a bunch of computer games with the license, and published NES and Super Nintendo versions as well, with NES development by Special Effects Software. It's presented as sort of a mini-game collection, with the levels switching between shooting galleries, side-scrollers, and top-down stages, and all with unflinching and unforgiving difficulty. The graphics and variety of gameplay styles are pretty impressive, not to mention showcasing some memorable moments from the film, but this is a really tough one to get into if you're not patient. This even made a list of really hard NES games that I made, if you want another video to watch next. And just to wrap things up here, I do want to quickly mention a few edge cases that almost could have qualified for today. Conan got an NES game, and the film Conan the Barbarian is definitely rated R, but the game was not really a direct tie-in to the film, and more so based on the general character, which was actually debuted in 1932 in Weird Tales magazine. And fun fact, this is essentially a computer game named Myth that was ported to the NES and rebranded to make some additional sales. The Punisher is a similar situation, which got an NES game in 1991, and there was a 1989 R-rated film as well, but the game's branding definitely leans into the original comic as source material. We've also got an NES beat-em-up starring the Toxic Crusaders, based on the cartoon and toy line from Trauma Team. But taking one step deeper, all of that stuff was based on the cult classic Toxic Avenger, which was very R-rated, not to mention deplorable, reprehensible, offensive, and essential viewing for lovers of trashy movies. And one bit of a stretch here, Dr. Chaos, which has no official movie tie-in at all, but it feels like it really wanted to be a game based on House, a great horror comedy from 1985, as Dr. Chaos features a few very specific monsters from that movie as enemies that you encounter in the game. I could also get even deeper if we wanted to get into anime and manga-based games with mature subject matter, with many NES and Famicom titles based on properties like Golgo 13, Akira, Devilman, and Koku Shinwa, and Fist of the North Star. Or even the horror RPG classic Sweet Home was based on a Japanese horror movie. But technically, that stuff was never officially rated by the MPAA, and I had to draw the line somewhere. More recent NES homebrew is another pool I won't be dipping into today to keep things focused, but I'll at least quickly shout out the works of 8-Bit Slasher, who's made a handful of short and free NES games based on horror classics, and even tossing a bunch of those icons into one game with the very fun All Hell Unleashed, which I did recently review on this channel, so check that out if you're interested. I hope you enjoyed today's video, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.